예, 안녕하세요.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Park Tae-young. I'm the Director General for International Economy at MOFA, and I will be your MC for today. Thank you very much for coming to this hybrid seminar celebrating the 25th anniversary of Korea's joining the OECD, and I would like to thank everyone who is joining us online. We also have representatives here from academia, from research, and also from the diplomatic corps stationed in Korea. We are in full compliance with COVID-19 guidelines. I'd like to ask you to please keep your face mask on at all times. We will skip the singing of the national anthem and go to the opening address, which will be delivered by the Vice Minister of the Foreign Affairs of Korea, Choi Jong-moon.
So I may take off the mask, right? Okay. 네, 안녕하세요.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Vice Minister Choi Jong-moon of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'd like to express my thanks to Secretary General Matthias Cormann of OECD for sending us the video message. I would also like to express my thanks to Vice Chairman of Accession of FKB and as well as Ambassador Petro Draganov of Bulgaria to Korea, Ambassador Gustav Slametska of the Czech Republic to Korea, as well as many of you who are participating here on site as well as online. I would also like to express my thanks to participants from KIEP and other panel members. Korea joined OECD as the 29th member on December 12th of 1996. And at that time, including myself, Korean people were so excited and so proud that Korea has finally become an OECD member state. Back in 1996, Korea had achieved double-digit economic growth for more than 3 decades. And it was recognized as a very successful economic development model around the world. However, we were not able to stop there. And joining the OECD has meant that Korea would shift away from economic growth-based system to become an advanced country through transformation and innovation in the entire society. And 25 years have passed, and we now would like to take a chance to look back on the past history. First of all, under the market economy system, which is a common value of the OECD countries, Korea has become a more mature market economy. For the past 25 years, Korea's trade volume increased 3.5 times, and now we have become the 6th largest trading economy in the world, and the per capita income has increased from $10,000 to $36,000. And this is much more than what we imagined back in 1996 when we were joining the OECD. And foreign investment policies and regulatory reform recommendations by the OECD helped Korea become a very attractive investment destination for global investors. And OECD provided us with very important guidelines for strengthening our competitiveness. And we were able to introduce capital market and foreign currency market liberalization and enactment of the law on promoting foreign investment, as well as introducing the system for regulatory impact assessment. And second, Korea was able to improve its education, environment, labor, and health along with OECD. Korea has improved the social welfare systems and address the duality of the labor market and improve the economic as well as environmental policies. And this has contributed to improving the welfare and well-being of the Korean people. And after joining the OECD, we have introduced the national pension scheme, parental leave system, and employment insurance. And we were able to also improve the competitiveness of the university education. And finally, Korea has also contributed to the OECD. I believe that Korea played a leading role in strengthening the new governance of the OECD. And OECD has been working as a guide for countries around the world by presenting the global standards based on facts and science for emerging global issues. Korea served as chair of the Ministerial Council meeting in 2009 and served as vice chair 3 times and has joined the OECD DAC in 2010. So we have become a responsible member of the OECD. And in In 2019, Korea led the adoption of OECD principles and AI based on Korea's strong digital sector. And since 2018, we have served as a chair of the Southeast Asia Regional Program of the OECD, leading the cooperation with non-OECD members in Southeast Asia. And we're going to hold the ministerial meeting in February next year, and our cooperation has been strengthening. So we have grown together with the OECD for the past 25 years, but there's much more that we need to do. We need to address the low fertility issue. We have the lowest fertility rate in OECD, and we need to strengthen social safety net in preparation for the aging society. We need to improve gender equality in the labor market and restructure the energy-intensive industries. So there's a lot of work that we need to do. And globally, we need to overcome the COVID-19 crisis and address the climate crisis and many other global challenges, including addressing the digital divide. And there is an ever more need for close cooperation and coordination in the international society. Therefore, the OECD has to play a bigger role. We are witnessing a changing geopolitics and emergence of economic security and supply chain disruptions. Therefore, we need to collaborate with OECD to offer new international norms based on objective analysis as we are going through a major paradigm shift. As we've been doing for the past 25 years, Korea will continue to share OECD's values and standards in order to build a more inclusive and sustainable society. And in order to respond to many major global challenges, Korea will continue to work with OECD and contribute to the international community. I hope that today's seminar will provide good guidance and insights as we build a better future. Thank you.
예, 차관님.
Thank you very much for your opening remarks, Mr. Vice Minister. Next, we would like to hear from the Secretary General of the OECD, Mr. Matthias Cormann, who has given us his remarks by video. We'll now watch the video.
Korea's economic transformation, known as the miracle on the Han River, has been a source of inspiration for countries all around the world. I'm delighted to congratulate Korea on the 25th anniversary of its membership of the OECD. Growing from one of the poorest countries in the world half a century ago to the world's 10th largest economy and 7th largest exporter, Korea provides a truly inspirational example of how sound economic policies and investing in future growth engines can drive successful economic development. Korea's achievements have been bolstered by investment, innovation, and human capital. For example, Korea's education system is one of the highest performing in the OECD. Korea has been able to harness the benefits of digitalization through its strong infrastructure, which provides nationwide 5G and fixed broadband and is underpinned by smart factories, grids, healthcare, cities, and roads. In line with the Korean leadership for the 2009 Declaration on Green Growth and the 2011 Green Growth Strategy, the Korean economy is building towards the green transition, already becoming a world leader in environmental research and development. Korea has contributed to the organization through its rich reform experience in areas such as public sector innovation, competition, and green growth, and is an invaluable representative for the OECD in Southeast Asia. I would like to thank Korea for its stalwart support for the OECD's efforts to build a stronger bridge to Asia and for its leadership and steer as a co-chair of the OECD Southeast Asia Regional Programme, helping to further deepen our relationship with countries in this region of strategic importance. Not only is this region a very important part of the world in terms of economic growth for the foreseeable future, it is also a critical part of seeking effective solutions to global challenges, be it on trade, climate change, or in relation to the pandemic. Korea continues to be a very active member of our organization, playing a leading role in annual OECD Ministerial Council meetings through various years, including as chair in 2009 and vice chair in 2021. Korea has executed an impressive strategy in its immediate response to the COVID-19 crisis, a strategy that reflects the learning and capacity it has built through its previous crisis responses. Korea's swift and effective measures to contain the virus and protect households and businesses limited the damage to its economy, placing it among the fastest recovering OECD countries. The implementation of the Korean New Deal will be crucial to address risks and opportunities associated with Korea's rapid digital transformation, to foster equality of opportunities, social mobility, and to bolster economic resilience. While much has been achieved, anniversaries are also an opportunity to reflect on our challenges, such as Korea's demographic trends in aging of the population, and chart a path to a brighter future. The close relationship between Korea and the OECD exemplifies mutual benefit and our shared values, and very much looks forward to continuing and further enriching our partnership in the years to come. I wish to congratulate Korea for organizing today's seminar, Korea and the OECD 25th Anniversary, the Past and Future, and in particular the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. I am confident today's seminar will provide valuable insights into the future of our cooperation. Thank you.
다음 순서로
Next, we're going to have a group photo session. For those VIPs, we're the 25 years of achievements and future tasks after joining the OECD. So please be patient.
예, 참고로 지난 10월 28일
And for your information, in Paris on October 28th, the OECD Secretariat and Korea's mission to OECD held the joint seminar in commemoration of the 25th anniversary of joining the OECD. And there is a publication that summarizes the achievements and progress after Korea joined the OECD. So please refer to the publication. Thank you.
예, 그럼 1세션을
Now let us begin session number 1. For the session, we have with us Han Min-soo, researcher at KIEP, who is in the International Macroeconomics and Finance Department. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Min-soo Han from KIEP. I'm going to make a short presentation, and then we will have a panel discussion with 3 experts. First, we have with us Professor Kang Tae-soo of KIEP. Second, Professor Ju Byung-gi of the College of Economics at Seoul National University. And finally, we have Jung Young-hoon, the head of the Health and Social Policy Program, Director General at the OECD Korea Policy Center. The topic of the first session is the achievements of the past 25 years. So we're going to take a look at the past 25 years in terms of social and economic development, and then we will invite the panel members for their discussion.
네, 이거 아까
As Vice Minister mentioned in detail, you may have understood the details about the history. As you may know very well, in 1996, in December, Korea became the 29th member of the OECD. But this did not happen overnight, but already in the 1980s, starting from the early 1980s, we received many recommendations. But Korea was quite cautious in proceeding with this, gaining the membership. So in 1993, Korea joined in NEA, and also we joined in the Steel Committee. As you may know, in 1997, Korea suffered from the Asian foreign currency crisis. And there was a coincidence, and there were some views about the relationship between Korea joining the OECD and the Asian foreign currency crisis. At that time, there was this issue of liberalization of the foreign currency market, and OECD did not demand Korea to open up its foreign currency market. And at the time of joining the OECD, Korea looked at other countries, and we received some recommendations on the foreign currency market, and we received 46 items which were understood for concession, and this means that we were able to get this many concessions through negotiations. And the Asian financial crisis occurred in 1997, not because Korea opened up its foreign currency market, but because of some of the lack of regulations that were able to oversee the foreign currency market. And after Korea joined the OECD, we achieved rapid growth. And within OECD, Korea took on many responsibilities. For instance, in 2009, we served as the chair of MCM, and we also served as vice chair 3 times for the MCM. This year, Korea and Luxembourg served as vice chair once again. It may not be easy to measure all the achievements of OECD membership, related to OECD membership, but largely we can take a look at the macroeconomic indicators to understand what benefits we reaped from the OECD membership. In other words, we are able to understand the direct and indirect benefit and achievements that we were able to enjoy after joining the OECD. We were able to improve transparency and improve our market economy and related mechanisms. And so there are many macroeconomic indicators we can refer to in order to understand the benefit of joining the OECD. So the first of such indicators is GDP. Among the OECD countries, the share of GDP has increased from 2% to 3.3%. And you may see some different numbers depending on the sources, data sources, but overall, as Korea has become more of an advanced economy, you can understand that our economic growth has slowed down, so the growth rate has converged to the OECD average. And here, you can see that Korea was pretty successful in responding to the pandemic. So even though there was some impacts, the negative impact of the COVID-19 situation on Korea was much less than other countries. And we can also look at the PPP, per capita GDP. And Korea's PPP per capita is similar to the OECD average. And you can compare this with Japan, and Korea's number is actually higher than that of Japan, and our figure is about twice higher than that of China. And next, we can take a look at the degree of openness to the global markets. You can take a look at the numbers and statistics related to foreign direct investment and trade. The graph on the left-hand side shows the GDP trade ratio. This means the trade volume actually is a combination of total exports and total imports. Until 2012, it increased, but since then it's been declining. But this is not negative at all. It really means that as the Korean economy continues to grow, the dependence on trade has been declining. It actually means that the domestic market in Korea has been growing. And later I'm going to discuss the current account balance, but this is a very common phenomenon that you may experience as your economy becomes more mature. And on the right-hand side, you can see the foreign direct investment flow. So you can compare between FDI inflows and FDI outflows. And there's been a lot of increase of inflows. So Korea's FTA inflows are similar to that of Japan, and as for foreign direct investment outflows, which is an outgoing foreign investment, it is similar to the level of Germany. Now let's take a look at the R&D situation. In 1996, Korea joined the OECD, and since then, our portion of R&D to GDP has been pretty high, and this ratio has continued to increase. And recently, Korea's R&D ratio to GDP is about twice higher than the OECD average. It means that we're making a lot of R&D investments. Then let's take a look at the digital economy aspect. As you may know very well, Korea has excellent digital infrastructure. We have high internet usage rate, and recently there was the digital competitiveness ranking announced by IMD, and Korea was ranked 8th out of 63 countries. This is actually based on the 2020 figure, and in this year, in 2021, our ranking stays at the 8th place. So we are at the top in terms of R&D investment in digital infrastructure and digital competitiveness. We took a look at some macroeconomic indicators, and now let's take a look at some of the socioeconomic changes that took place in Korea since we joined the OECD. The first of which is the demographic change. As the Vice Minister already mentioned, the Korean population is rapidly aging, and the fertility rate is less than 1, which means that the number of babies per woman is less than 1. This means that the population is shrinking. And the portion of senior citizens, the older citizens, is increasing. Based on the statistics from the UN, you can see that along with Spain and Japan, Korea will be one of the few countries that have old population. And this is something that we need to pay attention to, and we need to address this issue. And the demographic changes have implications on other challenges that Korea is faced with, because this is very much related to the elderly poverty issue, and also it is related to the issues in the labor market. Korea still has this duality issue in the labor market, a very big gap between regular and irregular workers. So this is something that we need to address. I'm going to now discuss the labor market in Korea. On the left-hand side, you can see the employment rate. Korea's employment rate has been increasing, and so it is converging to the OECD average. But as you may understand very well. In Korea, the per capita labor hours is relatively high. It has been reducing, but it is still high. But the retirement age is actually pretty early compared to the OECD countries. In Korea, the age is 71, which is pretty there's a big gap between Korea and OECD in terms of the retirement age. And there's also wage inequality issue. There's this duality issue in the labor market, and improvements have been made. As you can see on the left-hand side, the wages for regular and non-regular workers, you can see the gap or the portion. So compared to the regular workers, non-regular workers earn 72% of what the regular workers earn. So there has been an improvement, but this has to be improved even further. And as I mentioned regarding the demographic changes, by the age of 55, they would officially retire from their main job. And then after they retire from their regular position at the age of 55, they will start to work in non-regular positions, and their wage or income level will continue to decline, and they will stay in the labor market. But their income levels would be quite low, and this would lead to elderly poverty issues. Therefore, the labor market duality issues and the aging population and the demographic changes are all interconnected. And so this is something that we need to pay attention to. And on the right-hand side, you can also see the differences between large companies and smaller companies. This may not necessarily be a bad news, but some companies are growing rapidly through innovation, and other companies are growing slowly. So there is this gap. But when you take a look at this data, compared to the other OECD member countries, there is a big gap between companies with high productivity and companies with low productivity. So there is a gap between large companies and smaller SMEs. And this results in the income divide between large companies and SMEs. Now, moving on to gender inequality, we have been making improvement, but we're still lower than the OECD average in terms of the female employment rate. And when it comes to the health issues, Korea has been successful in responding to the pandemic. And so there has been some progress in terms of health improvement. But when you take a look at the number of doctors per capita and also current expenditure on health, we are still lagging behind. And moving on to energy and environment, progress has been made, but compared to the OECD average, the ratio of renewable energy is still low, and the energy intensity is still larger than the OECD average. And let's skip and go to the final slide. This is about the current account and net foreign asset. When you take a look at the past economic growth strategy, it was mainly about concentrating on the manufacturing sector, and it was also mainly driven by exports. So that was the main strategy in the past. But as I mentioned, our population is aging, and we have some labor supply issues. So these beg the question of whether we can continue to maintain the export-driven economic growth model. So on the left-hand side, you can see the current account balance changes. What is interesting here is that the balance of goods has been taking up a large portion, but when we look at the primary income, this is an area where we need to improve to boost our income level further. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. Now I'm going to invite Professor Kang Tae-soo for his panel discussion. Thank you.
말씀 잘 들었습니다.
Thank you very much. I listened well to the presentation. My name is Kang Tae-soo of KIEP, the College of Business. In 1995, 1996, when I was at the Bank of Korea, I remember going to Paris about 10 times or so on business trips for the OECD evaluation and before Korea's accession to the OECD, and now it's been 25 years. Now, that was when Ko Seung-bum, the head of FSC, was a deputy director at the time. I remember we would go to Paris and go through a lot of those meetings, and it was very difficult. Now that we are celebrating 25 years of partnership with the OECD, I want to look at Korea's commitment to OECD as well as the different challenges that the OECD is confronting and how they are related to us here at the Republic of Korea. To begin with, we often in Korea discuss OECD average. So when we try to give our own argument on an issue, we say that this is in line with OECD average or not. We think that this OECD average is a kind of norm, or it's a very representative benchmark here in Korea. In fact, it is so much a part of our lives that we talk about OECD average rule in the golf courses. And this so-called OECD rule is that when you pay and then later on you have won back all of these different winnings, then you have the responsibility to give back what you've won. And this is in line with the principle of the OECD that those developing nations that have developed and become advanced economies should now give back. And I think that if we were to consider that principle, Korea has done a very good job in trying to give back to OECD. The OECD, best practice, peer group pressure, like-minded, these are some of these different expressions that you hear at the OECD. We try to present the best practices, best policy practices, and with like-minded countries to try to share these values with one another. And this is very important because when we consider why benchmarks are important, earlier we had the opportunity to hear from Matthias Cormann, the Secretary General of the OECD, who mentioned the miracle of the Han River. This is an expression that is often used, but this is also the result of the 5-year economic plan, which lasted until 1981, where Korea really worked very hard to accelerate economic development. But back then we didn't have a benchmark, and so we say it's the miracle on the Han River, but it was really a way for us to see an deepened economic interdependence, wider inequality, and more social conflict. So this is why I say that the role of benchmarks is very important. And when we talk about OECD, the OECD recommendations, they are very strong pressure, a pure pressure on these different countries. So if there is any kind of a political populism, the OECD recommendations can be a check to curb the rise of populism in different countries. This is also one of the beauty of OECD, one of the strengths that the OECD offers. And within the Korean economy, we see that the OECD's benchmarking function has become more important. As the Vice Minister has mentioned, with low birth rates and aging, the net carbon neutrality, gender equality in the labor market, fiscal soundness, and national debt. There are many different arguments and debates across these different issues, and which is why the OECD recommendations, their role as these benchmarks is increasingly getting important. Another key point is that Korea, in its contribution to OECD, have to have some kind of representation that is in line with its contribution. Right now, of the OECD's budget, Korea accounts for 3.5%, which is, I think, placing Korea the 7th largest of the contributor to OECD. There are about 80 Koreans working at the OECD headquarters, but we don't see a lot of high-ranking OECD. Masako, I think, one of the Deputy Secretary General, I believe. But other than this colleague, the others are from the US and from other countries in the West. So I think that we in Korea should try to claim more representation at the higher levels at the OECD, which will put us in line with our contribution. And another suggestion that I would like to give to the OECD side is that I think this could be a very big challenge for OECD, which first of all is the role of China. China is not a current member of the OECD. And with the accession of China, OECD can play a fuller role. But because OECD is not a member of OECD, what happens is they can have strong capital controls. But this very strong capital control could lead to different damages for countries like us, because Korea has completely opened its financial market. So this means that if there is a problem in China, the surrounding countries or media outlets like Financial Times can give these suggestions for opening the capital market and try to ease capital control to China. So this shows us that this is not a level playing field. This is not a level game. So I would like to ask OECD to consider this issue. And the second thing that I want to say is that the OECD is an international organization, and in some instances, its stance, its position is not completely in line with other international organizations such as the IMF. This means that in 2008, when there was the global financial crisis, there were these macroprudential measures that were adopted, and this means that we issue these capital flow management. But at the time, IMF's institutional view was that it was okay. This was a okay way to go. But at the time, OECD said that this was a cap code on the liberalization of capital movement, that this was breaching the free flow of capital. And so there was a lot of tension at the time. I don't know if this tension has been eased between these different international organizations, but what I'm trying to say is that the OECD should take this into account. That one of the important establishment principles of the OECD is to try to allow for financial stability of the membership. And so, for these different systems and institutions that have to do with financial stability, because IMF has given its arguments against what the OECD was trying to say, this leads to a break between their different roles. So I am hoping that OECD can work together with other international organizations, especially when it comes to financial stability measures, in their responses to the member countries, to try to provide one voice to the different member countries. Of course, with the capital flow management, we've seen a lot of progress in that regard since then. And so OECD has also adjusted its earlier stance. So I'm not trying to say that OECD is the same as it was 10 or 12 years ago, but the situation could again occur. So from the point of view of the constituency, I'd like to ask the OECD to really try to put the interest of the membership at heart. And of course, I'd like to extend my congratulations to all of us on the 20 years of partnership we've had with OECD.
예, 말씀.
Thank you very much, Professor Kang. Next, I'm going to invite Professor Chu Byung-gi of SNU for his comments.
예, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. I am Chu Byung-gi from Seoul National University. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this panel discussion, which is very meaningful. First of all, I'd like to mention that the OECD is very meaningful and important for Korea. In some sense, I can say that Korea went through colonialization, and we also fell victim to the imperialism in the past. And it was a very cruel and unfortunate history. And then when this was coming to an end, there was this big division between socialism and democracy, resulting in the Cold War. And this was the beginning of the tragic war on the Korean Peninsula. And now, even in the 21st century, we're still under the legacy of the Cold War. And at the time of the Korean War, we were one of the poorest countries. But now we have a prosperous democracy, and we have economic growth rate that is similar to the OECD average. But still, in the 21st century, there are many challenges we need to address. Many advanced countries were able to develop many measures to address economic inequality and other social issues for the past 100 years. But we still have not been able to tackle corruption and political issues, as well as social injustice and social inequality. In addressing these social challenges, the OECD can provide very useful guidelines and recommendations. And I also believe that Korea's experiences can be very helpful in helping other countries coping with similar challenges, and many benchmarks you can refer to understand the progress of Korea. But once again, we need to think about this issue of some of the setbacks that we had to experience since joining the OECD, especially when you think about the qualitative growth of the capital market. I believe that the progress was very slow. So this is something that we need to address so that we can become a more mature economy. And this is also a way of reducing Korea's gap against other advanced countries. Especially, we need to focus on social welfare and well-being. We need to strengthen the social safety net, and social expenditure has to increase to the level of the OECD average. And the delivery of social services has to improve as well. And we need to provide more manpower and support for the social programs, so that we can have better redistribution functions of the social systems to address income inequality. Health and welfare and other social sectors need to hire more people. And if you expand social networks and social programs, you can hire more people and the quality of jobs will increase. And we need to also deal with inequality issues. For the past years, there has been very significant increase in the income inequality. And Korea's inequality situation worsened much faster than other OECD countries. In particular, in the labor market, as was mentioned already by Dr. Han, we have serious income disparities between sectors and between industries and between regular and irregular workers, and also between different sizes of companies, between large companies and SMEs. For instance, large companies with more than 500 employees, their share of the total wage is more than 52%. When you look at France or the US, the portion is 80% or 70%. This means that there is a very big bipolarization in terms of income, and the lowest income level, where these brackets are far behind the high income brackets. So in terms of per capita income, we're pretty good, but there's a big income divide. Korea has been successful in its economic development in the past because there was a lot of social mobility and economic mobility. There was education and education opportunities, and we were able to build the human capital in the past. However, not so much anymore. So if Korea wishes to become a more advanced economy, we need to build a momentum for developing human capital. But now we have very big inequality issues, and there is unfairness and imbalance and inequality in terms of opportunities and education. And there's a lot of unnecessary educational spending, which has not been efficient. So I believe that the prospect for Korea is pretty bleak. According to some statistics, the social mobility was perceived to be very low by parents. And in the early 2000s, the pessimistic views was about 10%, but now the pessimistic views account for more than 50%. So this means that the parents do not believe that there's enough social mobility opportunities for their children. So, and the educational inequality has worsened, especially for those children from the less privileged groups. They are given less opportunities. When you look at the college entrance data, the top 5 universities and colleges of medicine and pharmacy, and these colleges, you can see that most of the students that are getting into these universities are from more fortunate backgrounds. And there's more than 70% of the rate of those students from less privileged families failing to get into good universities. And so there's a very big difference between top 20% of the income families and top bottom 20% in terms of educational spending. So there is so much unnecessary competition and so much unnecessary spending on private education, which has led to lack of educational opportunities for students from poor families. In the past, we had much diversity, but not anymore, because more than half of the college students are from college students from the top universities are from wealthier family backgrounds, and they will continue to get good jobs and they will become lawyers and doctors. So these top ranking universities that are funded by the government would only admit students from wealthier backgrounds. This is a very big problem.
인재를 사회 각
Also, universities and colleges, they should be able to admit students from many different regions, from many different backgrounds. However, universities are not making that kind of effort. They tend to choose the easier method of admitting students from the fortunate backgrounds. This is a big loss to the country because we may not be able to tap into human resources that are talented, that are capable, who are from the less fortunate backgrounds. We have many brilliant students in other parts of the country, not just in Seoul or the surrounding area. So there are many different kinds of discriminations and inequalities in Korea. We not only have income inequality, but also well-being and welfare inequality as well in our society. So there's a very high correlation between the level of the quality of life and the quality of work. There are many platform employees and gig economy employees that are suffering. And they are not really able to voice their opinions in the process of decision making. So they're not well represented. And once again, they are not able to enjoy their welfare and well-being and health. And so these people do not have much voice and much representation. Therefore, their positions are not well reflected in the decision-making process, and their wages are low, and they're experiencing employment insecurity, and they're not able to enjoy their leisure time, and they have to work long hours. We need to work on improving the fair transactions and labor equality. If we do not improve our systems and regulations and laws related to these areas, we will never be able to address inequality. The capital market system has been developed for the past century, but this capitalistic approach has led to many social problems, including monopoly and concentration of power in certain groups of people, and corruption and many other injustice and unfair practices. And these need to be addressed in Korea. Last but not least, I'd like to mention that there is lack of transparency and corruption in the public sector. This has to be addressed immediately. There is lack of balance of power economically and politically. And all of these issues that I mentioned previously need to be addressed along with transparency.
권력기구들이 이러한 우리가
It means that authorities and government institutions have to improve as well.
변화를 거부하면 절대 변화가 이루어지지 못합니다.
If they refuse to change, then we will not be able to improve our society. We have the prosecutor's office and many other public authorities. They are so outdated in terms of their mindset. And even though their officials engaged in corruption, they're not fired, they're not punished in any way. So especially the legislative body and the prosecutor's office, their sanction levels really low. In the past, they were rather protected because of the division of power in the government, but they often would abuse their power to gain personal interests. And there's been this collision among different parts of the government and between the public and the private sector. These systematic and structural corruption and corruptive practices need to be corrected immediately. Thank you.
이병기 교수님 감사합니다. 예.
Thank you very much, Professor. Lastly, we would like to turn to Mr. Chung Young-hoon, DG of the OECD Korea Policy Center. I'm actually not the head of the center. I am the Director General, but thank you. So I am from the OECD Korea Policy Center. I am the DG of Health and Social Policy Program. So today's discussion is quite extraordinary because typically we are asked to comment on the presentation, but today we have heard from the presentation, but the discussants are actually adding their thoughts to the presentation instead of just refuting or commenting on the points made in the presentation. Because we have been with OECD for 25 years, we've heard of a lot of these numbers and statistics, which is also helpful, but in this can see that we've seen a lot of improvements for both sides and sort of quantitative improvements. However, I want to ask whether we've also seen corresponding qualitative growth, and I think that this is still a question mark for both of us, especially for Korea. And we can raise different issues, but I want to particularly talk about social policy in more detail. In the presentation, we heard about labor, wages, gender equality, and welfare. We've heard about these different categories, and as you can see, we've seen these improvements, especially in the quantitative sense, but I also want to talk about the improvements made in the qualitative sense, because I think that Korea still has some challenges ahead of it in terms of social policy. And I want to focus on three things in particular. This has been mentioned in the presentation, but I want to talk about demographics once again, because this has wide repercussions for the Korean economy and Korean society as well. So I would like to talk about that. And particularly, especially within demographics, I want to talk about not just aging, but the income protection of the elderly, which also has ties to the pension scheme. So this is a big challenge for us, and we don't have a very clear solution forward. And lastly, the health and welfare side, of course, every year we have these statistics, and we produce these statistics every year in line with OECD statistics, but I just want to briefly touch upon that. And also within social policy, as has been mentioned by the other discussants, that especially when it comes to welfare spending, we can have a lot to talk about, and so I won't be able to discuss all of these in depth, but I want to talk about these three things in more detail. With the demographics, if we look at the numbers, the fertility rate, combined fertility rate, has gone down below 1, in fact. So we've been the lowest of the OECD member countries for 7 years consecutively, but things do not seem to be improving at all, which is the biggest problem. And also with aging, so we will be entering into an ultra-age society, super-age society by 2025, which is 1 year before 2026, which was what was earlier anticipated. And so some people might think that this could be not that bad, but the accelerated pace at which we are entering into this super-age society is quite worrisome, because this is going to drop a huge bomb on us. And so this is a very big question mark. With demographics issues, there are many different statistics that already have been presented, so I'm sure that many of you are well aware of this, but especially with the elderly population, with their income levels, I think we have to think about this, because with the relative poverty rates of the elderly population and the costs associated with their care, are continuing to go up. There's what they call EDIC at the OECD, and their statistics say that OECD's percentage is about 28.6%, whereas in Korea it's 22%. But 4 years later, Korea is going to go up to about 38% versus OECD's 25%. And so with relative poverty rates, as you know, this goes below the 20% mark. OECD was 15.7 compared to 43.5 of Korea in 2018. If we look at poverty rates, it's 16%, but for the elderly population, it's 43%. So that's almost a percentage point difference of about 20%. So this relative poverty rate for the elderly population, when we put this together with the accelerated aging of our society, this is a very big challenge for us. With income protection, we look at the National Pension Service, which is going to see that the National Pension Service, the pension levels are going to continue to go down. As of 2018, the net income protection level was just about 37%, whereas OECD is about 49%. The national pension, began with 60% of income protection levels, but has consistently gone down to about 40%. It's going to continue to go down to about 40% by 2028. So this shows us that the income replacement rate is going to continue to go down, whereas the costs of the care associated with the elderly are going to go up. So we don't know if Korea can bear these cost burden, which I think is very difficult in terms of the qualitative analysis. And lastly, with health and welfare, if we look at health, different health-related statistics, and has been mentioned, the healthcare costs has been mentioned by some of the other speakers, but with the health and welfare, our health systems are quite top class, and we've heard that our medical facilities have been top class, and their life expectancy is already quite high, as you know. With the mortality rates with the health and welfare system, we can see that typically it's for OECD, it's 200, whereas in Korea it's 144. So there is a little bit of a difference. But with the resources, I know that this is often talked about, but with the medical professionals, with the human resources, if we look at clinicians per 1,000 doctors, we are 1/3 of OECD average, and with the nurses, it's about 1/2 of OECD average. And with the beds, hospital beds in the medical facilities, OECD average is 4.4. Korea is 12%, so threefold increase. We have 16 to 17 in terms of medical facilities. So this shows us that we don't have a lot of human resources, but we have a lot of physical resources, such as beds and hospital facilities. And as has been mentioned, the household burden of costs for household medical expenses has continued to go down, but the OECD average is 19%. Korea's is slightly a little bit nearing 30%. With the welfare total amount, we are perhaps about the welfare spending as of the GDP, including the delivery system and etc., there is still some wherewithal for increase. Because we have been with OECD for 25 years now, we have worked very hard for the last 25 years, and the economic improvements has been seen, and it's evident in the quantitative numbers. But with the health and welfare aspects, especially when we look at some social indicators, and especially in the qualitative side, there's still a lot of challenges that we have to achieve. We have to see this as an implication for us as this 25th anniversary comes before us to try to see if we can improve on this further. Thank you.
감사합니다.
Thank you very much for your discussion. What I'd like to say is that to try to summarize it, Professor Kang talked about the OECD stance on the capital market and the possibility of China joining the OECD. And the IMF has certain views which may not be well aligned with the views of the OECD. And these may cause some challenges for various member countries when it comes to their policy discussions. And because there may be some conflicting views between the IMF and the OECD, and this was quite important for me. And moving on to Professor Chu, you mentioned about various social issues that we need to address, and I may not be able to summarize everything, but I think it's mainly about inequality in terms of opportunities and education. And he mentioned that all these issues are very serious and concerning. And so we need to advance our mechanisms in the public sector and also our institutions and regulations. We need to reform our systems, but he's saying that there's not much potential. And this is my best attempt to summarize your discussions. Of course, your discussions were more extensive and more in-depth. And moving on to Director General Chung Young-hoon, you talked about senior citizens' poverty issues, and also talking about the demographic changes and income guarantee, especially with relate to the pension system. And we have achieved quantitative growth. That's quite true, but we need more qualitative improvement, especially in the case of welfare and health. You may think that the expected life expectancy is pretty good, but when you think about the medical professionals, we need to improve more in these areas. In other words, we need to improve the quality of the healthcare system, not just the quantity. So all of these panel members, is there anything else that you want to add? And then I'd like to open the floor for questions. If you have any questions or comments, please raise your hand.
네, 말씀해 주세요.
Thank you very much. My name is Juan Jose. I'm the Minister Consular of the Embassy of Peru in Korea. My question is related to, as you may know, Peru is a candidate to become a member of the OECD. And my question is related as Korea experience, as Korea development experience, what do you think is the most important issue to take in account in order to support or in order to strengthen this candidature, the framework, the institutional framework, the political economy, or the inequalities that must be taken care of in the order to reduce inequalities. Peru has several years of economic growing until the pandemic, of course. We reduced a lot of our poverty rates, and we are working very hard to strengthen our institutional development. So I congratulate Korea in this 25th anniversary of becoming a member of the OECD, but as experience for countries like us that are postulating to become paying members, what do you think is the most important issue to address? Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Petko Draganov. I'm the ambassador of Bulgaria. Very interesting discussion. You spoke about the aging population and the problems that that creates. I think it's a general problem in Europe as well. Are you envisaging raising the retirement age in Korea, and what specific measures do you think would be useful in tackling this problem? Thank you.
혹시 토론자 좀
Of the panel members, is there anyone who would like to comment on these questions?
I think I tried to address the first question exposed by Peru embassy. 한국말로 됩니까? Speak in Korean, please. 한국도
Just like what Peru is going through when we were getting evaluated for the OECD membership, I was actually involved in that process. For 2 years, I went to EBRD, and we also went to the market evaluation committee, and the same questions were raised. So
try to go back to our data. Just be seen it, and it's way before 96, 94, 95. That's a tremendous, I think, a source of information that are there. And also to go back to a lot of the press articles, columns, and exposed in Korean war in English, So then you can realize what's the problem in Korea right at that time, preparing for candidacy of OECD membership. So that's my first the suggestion to you. And I think the rest of the I think the second preparation for your side is try to go back to the I think we have 38 countries already. They had exactly the same question, same experience that you have right now. So that's very good for you to contact with the OECD Secretariat to get some information about that past history of each and specific countries had a very much peculiar experience when that attached to that country. So I think Peru has a very peculiar experiences that other countries has not had. So I think those two approaches are very good for preparation, preparing for other countries' experience as well as their past experience. And I think the OECD is namely their best practices is out there. So I think starting point is to try to tackle with the secretariat. That's my suggestion for you.
네, 강 박사님 감사합니다. 교수님 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Professor Kang.
저기 그래서 이제 보건복지
When it comes to health and welfare policies, obviously there are many different policies that we could think about. And if we were to look at some of the references in Korea, perhaps you can maybe look at the pension system as how it's set up in Korea. As I mentioned before, our national pension service started too late. And this, I think, in line with the low birth rates and aging, it's making it very difficult for us to find a solution out of this very difficult social issue. If we were to resolve this issue, I think that some of the policy implications that we could think about, especially in line with the pension, is right now we have pension service that we purchase into. We buy into the pension every month. We put in a monthly kind of amount, and so later on we will be able to get this back. But perhaps if we were to try to set this up sooner, then it will be able to provide us with more of a cushion. And so in terms of fiscal and financial soundness, when there's an emergency situation, then maybe people can reach into their pension fund. And so perhaps we can try to make a stronger, more strong and robust kind of financial safety net for our population. When it comes to the welfare issues with income, this is really a case of income redistribution. So with low-income groups, their income and wages, their cash and in-kind kind of services to the low-income households, and the stronger delivery system for these cash and in-kind services should be more reinforced. If we were to look at the more important issues, I think that if we can design policy with a long-term perspective in mind and try to do it in a goal-based approach, I think that is very important when it comes to policy.
네, 본부장님 답변 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. We are running short on time and we're quite behind the schedule. So I believe we need to close this session. And so once again, Professor Kang, Professor Chu, and Director General Chung, thank you very much for your contribution and your discussion. Thank you.
예, 일체선 아주
Thank you very much for this first session. We were able to identify the pending challenges that we need to address going forward in the future. We will have a short break, and then we will begin session number 2 at 4:25. Thank you.
지금 한국의 문화예술 콘텐츠가 세계적으로 주목을 받고 있는 거에 대해서 되게 자랑스럽게 생각합니다. 제가 춤을 추겠다고 결심한 순간은 제가 할 수 있는 것 중에 가장 좋아하고 잘할 수 있는 거여서 그랬던 것 같아요. 한국인은 많은 아픔을 견뎌내고 일어선 민족인 만큼 고통을 감내하고 인내하고 부지런하게 달려가는 것에 두각을 나타낸다고 생각합니다. 저도 한국인의 한 사람으로서 어렸을 때부터 그런 가치들을 배우고 익혔고 제가 이 자리에 오기까지 그 역량이 도움이 되었던 것 같습니다.
Korea is well known for its remarkable history of going from one of the poorest countries in the world to becoming one of the most advanced countries in the world in a very short amount of time.
OECD의 활동으로 세계는 더 공정해지고 투명해졌으며 한국 역시 OECD가 추구해온 민주주의와 인권, 시장경제와 개방경제라는 보편의 가치를 실천하며 성공 사례를 만들어 왔습니다.
For graduates, the biggest concern is the transition from education to work. Korea's Youth Job Search Supporting Fund has become the best means of supporting young people in the job transition.
Korea's digital policies are in line with the OECD recommendations. For example, we promoted competition by improving our broadband licensing regulations to lower the barriers to entry in the market. Relaxing telecom investment restrictions, Korea will continue to carry out diverse policies to achieve a human-centered AI.
Korea has been a very ideal place for digital innovation. There's a very high level of talent density for IT, including AI research and engineering, mainly due to the high level of education. And from an AI perspective, because of Korea's well-digitized IT infrastructure, we've been able to collect a large number of data.
After a year of implementing Korea's Green New Deal, we have seen tangible results across all sectors. This Green New Deal will enable us to seize the new opportunity of green economy and new jobs. Korea has been a solid partner of OECD for the past 25 years and will continue to work with OECD and the rest of the world in the global journey toward carbon neutral for all.
Today, Korea is committing itself to make the green transition while maintaining economic development. Now, Korean businesses and civil society are more active, demanding more from their government leaders on climate issues, and it can only strengthen Korea's green commitment. The OECD, which has accumulated knowledge and experience with advanced policies, could work with Korea to explore Korea's more active future role in dealing with climate change and the SDGs.
OECD가 지향하는 목표가 높을수록 인류의 미래는 희망적이 될 것입니다. 한국은 앞으로도 OECD가 추진하는 지속 가능한 포용적 성장의 길에 함께 할 것입니다.
I would like to thank Korea for its stalwart support for the OECD's efforts to build a stronger bridge to Asia and for its leadership and steer as a co-chair of the OECD Southeast Asia Regional Program, helping to further deepen our relationship with countries in this region of strategic importance. Not only is this region a very important part of the world in terms of economic growth for the foreseeable future, it is also a critical part of seeking effective solutions to global challenges, be it on trade, climate change, or the pandemic.
The world is facing new challenges, namely the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, inequality, aging population, and rapid digitalization. We need to keep working together to deliver better policies for better lives.
지금 한국의 문화 예술 콘텐츠가 세계적으로 주목을 받고 있는 거에 대해서 되게 자랑스럽게 생각합니다. 제가 춤을 추겠다고 결심한 순간은 제가 할 수 있는 것 중에 가장 좋아하고 잘할 수 있는 거여서 그랬던 것 같아요. 한국인은 많은 아픔을 견뎌내고 일어선 민족인 만큼 고통을 감내하고 인내하고 부지런하게 달려가는 것에 두각을 나타낸다고 생각합니다. 저도 한국인의 한 사람으로서 어렸을 때부터 그런 가치들을 배우고 익혔고 제가 이 자리에 오기까지 그 역량이 도움이 되었던 것 같습니다.
Korea is well known for its remarkable history of going from one of the poorest countries in the world to becoming one of the most advanced countries in the world in a very short amount of time.
OECD의 활동으로 세계는 더 공정해지고 투명해졌으며 한국 역시 OECD가 추구해온 민주주의와 인권, 시장경제와 개방경제라는 보편의 가치를 실천하며 성공 사례를 만들어 왔습니다.
For graduates, the biggest concern is the transition from education to work. Korea's Youth Job Search Supporting Fund has become the best means of supporting young people in the job transition.
Korea's digital policies are in line with the OECD recommendations. For example, we promoted competition by improving our broadband licensing regulations to lower the barriers to entry in the market. Relaxing telecom investment restrictions, Korea will continue to carry out diverse policies to achieve a human-centered AI.
Korea has been a very ideal place for digital innovation. There's a very high level of talent density for IT, including AI research and engineering, mainly due to the high level of education. And from an AI perspective, because of Korea's well-digitized IT infrastructure, we've been able to collect a large number of data.
After a year of implementing Korea's Green New Deal, we have seen tangible results.
So we will now move into the second session, cooperation between Korea and the OECD to respond to digital transformation. We would like to hear from Mr. Han Min-soo. He will continue to be the moderator. We have one presenter and 3 discussants for this session. We would like to hear from the Executive Director of the International Cooperation Research Division at Korea Information Society Development Institute, Dr. Ha-Yun Kang. We have 3 discussants, Professor Han-Young Lee of Chunga University. The second discussant is Chang-Kun Lee, Assistant Professor at the KDI School of Public Policy at KDI. And our last discussant is from KIEP, from KIEP, the Associate Research Fellow at Trade and Investment Policy Team, Sang Jun-ye. We'd now like to hear from Dr. Kang. Hello, I've just been introduced from the KISDI. My name is Ha-Yun Kang. I didn't know whether I should give my presentation in English or Korean, but as you can see, the presentation materials are listed in English, whereas I would like to give my presentation in my mother tongue. Earlier on, we were talking about some broad sweeping issues concerning OECD-Korea cooperation, but today I would like to focus more on digital transformation, OECD projects regarding this issue. I want to talk a little bit about the role of KISDI, my organization, in this presentation. So KISDI, the organization that I'm affiliated with, was established in 1988 to try to work on ICT-related, especially telecommunications-related matters. And we have continued to develop, along with the developments of the telco industry in Korea. At the time, however, we were focusing on telecommunication, and in the 1990s, we focused on internet, and in the 21st century, we've been focusing on digital matters. Now we look at internet broadcast, telecommunication, various different digital-related matters, and the social repercussions related to these issues. So we are engaged in research in this at our government-sponsored research institution. We look at the international trends regarding telecommunication matters, and we also try to work together with the Korean government in international fora on ICT-related policy matters. We provide support to the Korean government, and so because of that, we also look at OECD's digital issues. We also engage in research related to these digital transformation-related projects that are done by international organizations such as OECD. So, as you know, OECD looks at policy issues that deal with economics of different countries, particularly member nations. It is a policy discourse leader in the international arena. Governments and policymakers, experts, all participate in this process. And therefore, the different specified agenda items that come out of these different discourse processes are transformed into policy recommendations, and the policy recommendations are taken up by governments around the world as policy references or policy standards. And so the agenda items that OECD deal with are of such particular interest to us here as well. When it comes to digital-related matters, I want to discuss what OECD is doing here. The OECD is going through this Going Digital project, but with digital transformation in general, as you know, in the 21st century in Korea, we use expressions like the fourth industrial revolution, and recently we've also heard the expression of digital transformation. And this digital transformation, this phenomenon, is witnessed right now through AI or blockchain, big data, many of these different new technologies. And with the rise of these new technologies, we are also looking at the qualitative transformation of industries, a new economic phenomena. And in this ultra-connected society, we try to look at the issues that impact labor, participation, isolation, gaps, all of these different socioeconomic trends that are coming about, which mandate the governments to respond to these with policy matters. And so we have to look at what we must do together. We need this kind of discussion on what we have to do and how we must act, because the technologies are evolving so quickly, but the standards and institutions regarding these are always falling behind. They're a step behind. In that regard, the OECD's goal is very important. OECD's Going Digital project has been done to facilitate these different issues that I mentioned before. There have been ministerial meetings, and this project began in earnest in about 2017, looking at eco-socioeconomic changes that are brought about by digital transformation and trying to support digital transformation-related policies. This is the largest digital transformation regarded policy support project of its kind. It began in 2017, and it's gone through Going Digital 1, Going Digital 2, and it's now in the Going Digital 3 phase. Digital technologies, as you know, are multi-purpose technologies, and so this means that because they have wide uses and wide applications, this kind of discussion cannot be done very narrowly. Therefore, with this project, there's this bureau called CDEP within the OECD that is leading the efforts. But with Going Digital, I can tell you that there are many different committees that are involved in Going Digital. Let me just briefly mention some of these committees to you, which are represented here on this slide. CDEP is the largest, the Committee on Digital Economic Policy on Regulatory Sandbox, Measuring Well-being, AI Strategy, Connectivity Device, Digital Security, National Digital Strategy, so various strategies and governance-related matters. Digital privacy, digital data portability, many of these different issues are dealt with by CDEP, but for more expertise-related matters, such as CMF looks at blockchain policy in particular, and with the CCP looks at consumer protection. They look at role of online marketplaces in enhancing consumer protection and consumer data and privacy issues. CFA, which looks at fiscal and financial related matters, looks at the digital tax, which is also a very current issue at the moment. And there's also CSTP, looking at open science and kind of digital science and innovation policy and systems. And LSAC looks at regulation, platform work in the digital age, especially because LSAC is devoted to labor-related issues. So many of these different committees are participating in this project. The project's outcome is going to come out soon. Going Digital 1 began in 2017 and lasted for 2 years. And from here, it tried to look at a basic understanding of what going digital or digital transformation means. So it looked at key properties of digital transformation, and it developed a policy framework. So looking at 7 different key properties of digital transformation. With the outcomes for the first phase, it came out with a synthesis report on Going Digital Integrated Policy Framework, report on measuring the digital transformation, and Going Digital Toolkit. So policy toolkits for policymakers and government officials to refer to. These were some of the outcomes that came out of the first phase, Going Digital 1. And then In 2019, 18-19 or so, I'm sorry, it was 2019 and 2020 where Going Digital 2 began. Based on this evaluation of the different properties of digital transformation, looking at two themes of artificial intelligence and blockchain technology, looking at the new opportunities and challenges of these frontier technologies. Some of the main outcomes of this is the OECD AI principles or the OECD AI Policy Observatory. Now we are in the Going Digital 3 phase, where they are particularly looking at data, because data is really the source and origin of these new technologies, and it's a kind of a production element. And so it's looking at data use and various issues related to digital data and the social and economic impacts, and it's built around 4 modules: data stewardship, access, sharing, and control. The second module is cross-border data flows with trust. And the third is data shaping firms and markets, business models, impact to markets. And the fourth module is to do with the data portability, data flows, and how to measure data flows. These are the 4 modules that are undergoing Digital 3, and this related work has to do with, it will try to present to us the foundational understanding of digital data and the use of data. The reports are being compiled right now, but when they come out, we can try to have a more rational and comparable understanding of digital data. So this could be very useful for the government in coming up with policies on digital data and the use of data. With this Going Digital project at OECD, these are some of the main outcomes and findings that come out of that project. Just additionally on CDEP's works and activities that I mentioned before, CDEP, as you understand, is heavily invested in digital transformation. It's the kind of core committee that looks at policy matters related to digital. And as everyone understands right now, the primary focus of digital technologies is artificial intelligence. So many of these AI-related discussions are being held at CDEP. So for example, in 2019, the OECD AI principles were announced, trying to come up with 5 different principles for trustworthy AI, and also policy recommendations there as well. In 2019, the Ministerial Council adopted this, and later at G20 and various different international fora, this same policy guideline was accepted and adopted. And then in 2020, the OECD announced its AI Policy Observatory that I mentioned before, based on the principles that I already mentioned. So looking at evidence-based policies regarding AI. To do that, the stakeholders' participation and communication are very important and necessary. Well, based on that, they created this online platform for AI policy, looking at AI principles, implementation, the guidelines, and different reference materials on this are included, and different national governments' action plans and their recommendations, and OECD's partner organizations, different data on measuring AI-related data. So all of these different information is included in the observatory platform. And there is an OECD AI networks of experts that are also being implemented. So some experts with expertise in this issue are brought into this kind of roundtable where they look at categorization of AI-related technology, look at case examples of AI use cases, and government's policies related to AI, and doing analysis of these policies are done by these experts. Because data governance has been a very big issue, they also look at data accessibility, sharing, and use of data. They're focusing on this with this network of experts, and they are trying to come up with the policy guidance to submit to different national governments. No, I skipped over some of these slides, but here, my earlier slide had to do with the CDEP's activities on AI, whereas this slide is on data governance. So OECD's activities related to data governance. I don't have a lot of time, so I just want to touch upon what Korea is doing in terms of its cooperation with OECD, with Going Digital. As I mentioned before, this at the OECD level is being done by multiple committees, and KIST, the research institute that I'm in, we are monitoring all of these different activities, but we cannot monitor each and every all of these different activities on our own. So I can just try to give you a slice of what I know. We're engaged in research and monitoring of what CDEP is doing at OECD, but Korea is known as an ICT powerhouse, but when it comes to digital transformation and our response, Korea's response to digital transformation, it's difficult to say that Korea's response is meaningfully different from other countries' response because this is such a new trend to all of us. So Korea is actively participating with other countries in trying to respond to this issue. One of the main activities that we do, especially when it comes to the OECD Going Digital project, is trying to share the case examples and case studies within Korea with our partner countries. So for example, in 2019 at the OECD Going Digital Summit, we announced and shared our case example of commercializing for the first time the use of 5G. We were also the vice chair of the OECD Ministerial Council meetings and also tried to engage in activities regarding the going digital and AI related matters. And at the time, there was a Ministerial Council recommendation on AI that was adopted and Korea participated there. But obviously Korea was not the only country driving this development. This was done together with different OECD member countries. Recently, some of the work that we've been doing at the recent MCM was that, again, as vice chair, we organized a forum on the implementation of AI principles. MSIT also organized a panel on facilitating the use and adoption of AI principles. So this was some of the activities that Korea did at the OECD level regarding going digital. What I just talked about Korea's OECD cooperation was represented in the slide that I just skipped past. But if I were to move into the conclusion, I can say that there is such dynamic changes with the digital economy. So when it comes to policy response to these changes in the digital economy, countries have to engage in really very much fast and dynamic sharing and cooperation with case examples. And I do think personally that OECD is the best medium for this kind of exchange. And the reason for that is because for the member countries to engage in information exchange, the number of countries here is, I think, appropriate. If there are too many countries, if the membership is too broad, then it would be very difficult to do. But the fact that OECD has like-minded countries, it's a smaller group of like-minded countries that can share in these policy objectives. I think that is very meaningful and very helpful. And recently, one of the trends is inclusive digital transformation. And so we're not just talking about economic policy, that digital transformation can lead to various social economic changes and implications. And so digital advanced nations have to respond to this actively. And in that regard, I think that the OECD's role is very significant. Especially in light of COVID-19, the issue of digital is not something that is far away. We have literally seen it play out in our lives very much so. So the related international discussions have to be done at a more active scale. So I think that the policy guidelines that come out of this and in the process of crafting the policy guidelines, I think that they have to be more facilitated going further. And in that regard, I hope that the ROK, as a member country of the OECD, should do its role. And I think that Korea is playing its role very actively. In the future, I hope that there will be more rich and extensive discussions in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kang, for your presentation. I can see that there are a lot of activities at the OECD on AI and digital transformation and the kind of role that Korea has been playing in this regard. And also, she mentioned about the future directions. Thank you for your presentation once again. Let's move on to the panel discussion. I'm going to invite Professor Lee from Chungang University for his comments and discussions. Hello, everyone. First of all, I'd like to say that it is my great pleasure to be here and be given this opportunity to make comments. What I understand is that this event has been organized to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the OECD membership. And I understand that we want to uphold the spirit of togetherness and partnership with the OECD and its member states. So given this understanding, what I can say and what I must say is about methodologies. In other words, in what methods we can use to pursue our partnership with the OECD. And in other words, this would also mean that we need to discuss what we can discuss and share with the OECD member states and what kinds of contributions Korea needs to make to the OECD and going forward. When we say there is an international organization or international conference or meeting, you can imagine meetings in Geneva that I used to attend, and the OECD was rather a place that I would just pass by. So I don't have much experience in attending meetings related to the OECD. But when it comes to the role and the significance of the OECD, I'm well aware. And it is my understanding that the OECD is an organization where global experts gather and discuss important issues. So in this context, I believe that there are many issues that Korea can discuss and share with the OECD, and we have to be on the same page with the OECD. And I would like to say that there's a very high level of expectation. And when it comes to digital transformation, since 2017, the OECD has been carrying out various activities. I am not here to mention what to add or what to subtract from the OECD programs and initiatives, but rather, I think we need to focus on what Korea can add to this entire discourse and discussions on digital transformation. I would like to say that Korea is moving ahead of the other countries, relatively speaking, when it comes to the digital transformation. This means that Korea is one of the few countries that have gone through some trials and errors. And of course, we're still at an early stage. We cannot talk about mistakes per se, because we have a very short history of digital transformation. But once again, I think it's very meaningful that Korea shares its experiences with the OECD member countries. So in this regard, I'd like to talk about supply across border. So cross-border supply is what I want to mention. So this cross-border supply traditionally was a default transaction method of goods. So in this type of transaction, producers of goods would deliver these goods to consumers in other countries by means of logistics and transportation. So the goods would be delivered, but there is no need for face-to-face interaction between the producers and the consumers. So from this goods transaction or goods delivery perspective, this would mean that there would be no possibility of service supply, because services are provided basically face-to-face, and once services are provided, then there's nothing left. It is very intangible, and there's nothing left, and there's nothing to be recorded. So when I was in college in the 1980s, when I read theories on international trade, we thought that services were non-tradable goods or non-tradable things. But later, I began to attend WTO meetings in the 1990s. It was actually the mid-1990s when the Uruguay round was completed. And one of the outcomes of the Uruguay round was cross-border supply of services, which was a very innovative concept. So when you look at the WTO agreements, you can find GATTS or GATS, the General Agreement on the Trade of Services. This is actually about cross-border supply of services, and it very clearly stipulates that there's mode 1 for service supply. But at that time, when I was attending these WTO meetings, I was not really able to understand how the cross-border delivery or cross-border supply of services would actually take place. And I had chances to talk with people from other countries as well. And a lot of people were still pondering upon the concept behind cross-border supply of services, because at that time, mode 1, whether or to what degree the mode 1 would expand going forward, was not fully understood. And at that time, many countries were engaged in the follow-up rounds of the Uruguay round, and there was less resistance to the opening of the cross-border supply of services. So regarding service trade, because services would ultimately have to be delivered face-to-face, so FDI would be the medium of supply of such services. In other words, mode 3, or commercial presence, would have to be done. It would be the precondition for service supply. But I remember it was 2005. That was about 10 years after the WTO. And so mid-1990s, there was this discussions at the Uruguay round, and there was a symposium a decade later. And at that time, mode 1, cross-border service, cross-border supply was the topic at the time of the WTO meeting in 2005. And there, experts mentioned that ICT is developing really rapidly, so mode 1 would become very important for services as well. And they warned that these would cause a lot of concerns for the authorities. And this was rather a warning from the experts about the development of digital technology, because if it is mode 1, this means that service providers do not have the commercial presence in the destination countries. So even if the authorities wish to regulate these activities, it would be practically impossible to regulate these service provisions. So when the services are provided, those companies in the country would be regulated, but foreign countries would not be subject to the same regulation. So this would lead to concerns about the counter-discrimination or unfair discrimination against foreign companies. And so there was a warning that the existing regulatory framework would not be effective. So at that time, there were these concerns raised. Now, what is happening today in 2021? This is already happening. So in terms of service trade, there's no need for face-to-face interactions between service suppliers and service consumers. Including Chungang University, most universities around the world were able to offer education despite the pandemic, and we're holding virtual seminars and virtual classes. And now in the textbooks on international trade, there's no mentioning that services are untradeable. So the cross-border supply of services and the mode 1, the key here is data and online platform. These online platforms support the digital ecosystem, and data serves as fuel or catalyst. So without online platforms and data, we would not have an online or digital ecosystem. So now the importance of mode 1 has been established in the services industry as well. And now the regulatory bodies are well aware of that, and data and online platforms are causing quite of a challenge for these regulatory bodies. Then what's the essence here? What's the key point here? When you think about these online platforms, they, in many countries that are registered as value-added telecommunication service providers. So there are basic telecommunication service providers and value-added telecommunication service providers. And the basic telecom service providers, they have some public responsibility, including the cabled telephone. But for value-added telecommunication service providers, they were not considered as having some public good. But that's not necessarily true, because these online platforms are registered as value-added telecommunication service providers, and they're not subject to the same regulations, but they have a lot of social responsibility. And some are even saying that the status of value-added providers is actually higher than the basic telecom service providers, but our regulatory framework is very outdated, and there's this big void in terms of regulation. So in the market, there are no regulations, no rules, and no playbooks, so there's a very low level of predictability, and there's a lot of tension. For instance, in Korea, we have this network usage fee-related disputes happening. So this is a very big issue. There's a legal battle going on over this issue. In other words, there is internet service access service providers, the broadband service providers. They are considered as infrastructure service providers. So we have these basic service providers, and then we have the online content providers, and there's a big dispute, actual legal case between these two sides regarding the internet access or network usage fee. And also there are controversies over in-app purchases. And when you take a look at the newspaper, you would see that Korea is the first country in creating a legislation on banning the in-app purchases. What this really means is that there are online platform providers and value-added telecom service providers. They need to hold some public responsibility or social responsibility, but to what extent are we going to impose that responsibility on these companies? When you take a look at the European market, since 2018, GDPR was introduced, and last year the Digital Services Act was created, and the Digital Market Act was created. So in Europe, there have been initiatives to create a legal framework. And the Digital Services Act and the Digital Market Act in EU mean that they are imposing some pre-regulations. And some argue that these are not market-friendly, and these may have some restrictions in terms of trade. Second, it is all about legal sovereignty, and in the mode 1, how are we going to define a permanent establishment or PE concept for digital companies? So using OECD BEPS, there was discussion on digital companies, but when you think about this establishment, business establishment, there was some effort to transform or convert permanent establishment into something of a digital establishment. But the BEPS discussion has been limited because there was a lack of agreement on this aspect. So this discussion on the notion of digital establishment may not take place actively. So this is something that I think we need to carry out serious discussions on. Then these two major issues that I pointed out, when there is a delay in our discussions on these issues, there may be some problems. For instance, when the market is saying that there are so many problems, then the government will have to respond and would try to cater to their concerns. And then the government will come up with its own responses. Just like in the case of Korea and the EU, they will come up with their own measures, and they may not take into account the positions of the other countries. Then ultimately, you may end up having or creating policies and regulations that will put the others at disadvantage. So It's a so this may continue on with this problem. So beggar thy neighbor approach may emerge, and this would have the potential of disrupting the existing trade regime and the trade mechanisms around the world. And secondly, when it comes to domestic regulations, these domestic regulations are not applied to foreign companies in the mode 1 according to the current regime. And then of course extraterritorial jurisdiction may apply. And in this case, I'm not saying I'm concerned, but in reality, actually, in Europe and also in Korea, there is extraterritorial jurisdiction that is being applied. And when such cases are repeated over and over again, then ultimately the multilateral trade system under the WTO may lose its ground. Basically, the WTO means that there are multiple countries coexist by following the best practices that are common to all of them. But if they end up pushing for their own interests, then the multilateral trade system may lose its ground and its support. And this will lead to major costs for all of us. Because now we are living in this digital era, and these online platforms, they are different from the past financial or other businesses, because these online platforms are actually serving as infrastructure for many economic activities. And in this regard, what can Korea do? What kind of contribution can we make? When it comes to digital transformation, I think Korea is a place where regulations are being tested. And at the same time, we have a very dynamic digital ecosystem. And we have many success cases as well. The Squid Game was a mega hit, and it is so popular all over the world. But in this process, in Korea, there are many heated debates going on. There is this analog paradigm and the digital paradigm, and there's this tug of war between the two paradigms. And we have these domestic companies versus foreign companies, and the traditional commercial districts versus online commercial spaces, and a competition between some government agencies. So we have multi-dimensional conflicts going on in Korea. And in addition, when you take a look at the legislations related to digital ecosystem, the pace is really fast, and it is pretty hardliners. And we have this mass production system. So overnight, there's a new law. So the pace is really fast. And there are many complementary laws and regulations created. And the pace in Korea is very different from what's happening in Europe or the US, because now at the National Assembly in Korea, these lawmakers are very diligent and hardworking. But as far as I know, there's a saying in Korea, there's a saying that if you want to go fast, you go alone. But if you want to go further, then you have to go together. And this is a saying that I heard. And so moving on to the online platform regulation, is it a matter that we need to act quickly, or is it a matter that we need to take a more long-term perspective? When you think about the technological, regulatory, and economic aspects of the online platforms, these all need to be considered. And collective wisdom and collective intelligence is really needed in trying to deal with the online platforms. And only when we all work together, we can come up with better solutions. So in this context, now we can work with the OECD, and we can make a contribution to the OECD because we have quite a lot of experiences, especially in the areas of online platform regulations. And our trials and errors and our experiences regarding our efforts to regulate the online platforms will provide valuable insights for the OECD. Thank you.
네, 이한영 교수님 감사합니다. 아주
Thank you very much. Professor Lee, you started with some basic concepts, the international economy, and told us about how these digital technologies have changed about all of these different policy matters and how the domestic and both international regulators have to respond to this issue. And lastly, you've said how Korea should act as a kind of testing bed and contribute in that regard to the developments at the OECD. We are almost out of time, in fact, so we still have about two discussants left. So I'd like to ask the two discussants to please just keep to your core discussion points. Professor Lee, would you like to go first? Hello, my name is Chang-Gun Lee at KDI. I am primarily interested in the changes at the industries and corporations and these different changes with the economy and how it impacts individuals and companies, and so this kind of gap that we also see represented in the economy. OECD's research analysis, when we take a look at these, have thus far looked at these different issues. So when it comes to inclusivity or inequality, I think that OECD has played a very big role in trying to come up with a policy framework. So for example, with the gap in between companies is expanding in the digital era. And those companies with the capacity to use of AI, I can say that there is a capacity gap between these different companies as well. This will lead to ever-increasing gaps in the future. And of course, this also would impact the employees and the workers working at these different institutions and the companies. So the gap will continue to increase going forward. As a solution to this issue, there are some policy recommendations that we can give in terms of data, tools, or access to human resources. We have to enhance the access to these different resources for SMEs. Despite these different accomplishments that we have made in the past, we still have a lot of homework that we must do in the future. And of course, Korea can contribute to how we respond to these challenges. Above all, when we talk about technologies, we can think about how we can have access and adopt these different tangible technologies, but research reports suggest that this kind of adoption of technologies is important, but that's not all. We have to utilize these technologies and how to leverage them in business decisions and management decision making. And so this means that digital literacy does not just have to do with using smartphones, but it talks about some kind of a different ability, how you can organizationally use AI and big data and try to enhance business management decision-making skills. And so this organizational capacity is very important, which is why the gap is not decreasing as quickly as we'd like. What OECD can do is it can test out different policies, and within different institutions, because there are so many member countries, they can look at these different use cases and try to provide different policy recommendations for different use cases. I have personally been involved in research for smart factories, and when it comes to smart factories, I can say that there are these companies that make very good use of smart factories, and I also wanted to look at how we can enhance human potential in using smart factories. Germany has been the front runner in this, so we can benchmark Germany's case. But of course, we need a kind of different approach in a different economic landscape. So we have to look at different use cases at OECD, and OECD can try to provide very meaningful policy recommendations and proposals for that. And I think Korea can contribute to this diversity. With smart factories, Germany is one of the front runners. It has an ecosystem with leading companies, but with Korea, we can provide more policy help and support to SMEs. We have consciously tried to provide this support to SMEs. So in line of this, we can provide this evaluation to OECD and also receive feedback from the OECD. So going forward, we can try to have a mutually beneficial kind of response to the digital era going forward and kind of respond to this gap between companies that is continuing to grow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So you talked about digital divide and mentioning of smart factory. There are different models between Germany and the US, and what kind of contribution Korea can make to the OECD regarding this. That's how I understand. And last but not least, I'm going to invite Dr. Ye Sang-jun from KIEP for additional comments on digital transformation and especially digital taxes. Please go ahead. Hello, I am Ye Sang-jun from the International Trade Department at KIEP. And what I'm going to discuss here is the final agreement on digital tax at the OECD, the background, and also its impact on the FDI, especially outbound FDI in Korea. And so I'm going to discuss this. I don't have much time, so I will move on pretty quickly. Since the past, the OECD has provided international taxation models, especially the model taxation will be provided from the OECD. So it is serving as a template and guideline. And so because of these guidelines, the international community was able to have more harmonized tax policies. Now, digital economy is growing really rapidly. So there are many multinational enterprises and there are issues of tax avoidance. So BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting discussions have been taking place for a long time, so that countries can respond to this issue. And a common framework was pursued. And more recently, the digital taxation was agreed at the OECD. Now, in this digital economy, what kinds of issues can take place with respect to tax avoidance? Even before a digital economy emerged, multinational enterprises avoided paying taxes by shifting their profit. So their profits generated in high taxation countries to low tax rate countries so that they can reduce burden on taxation. So that was basically the profit shifting practices of many multinational companies. And so they would do some action to shift their profits, and they would utilize internal transactions and other measures to increase revenue from low tax rate countries. But in the digital economy, there's another issue that can take place, as Professor Lee mentioned. We don't have a clear understanding of the permanent establishment. So under the existing regime, the PE has to be the basis for taxation, and the profit generated from the PE will be taxed in the jurisdiction where the PE is located. However, the digital economy, companies headquartered in other countries can generate profit by providing services in Korea, even though they don't have a commercial presence in Korea. One good example is Google. Google has service located in Singapore, but they provide services to Korean users. And there are many app market revenues. They are not recognized as revenue in Korea, but they're recognized as revenue taking place in Singapore. So this means that all the sales in Korea would reduce and the sales in Singapore would increase accordingly. Therefore, they would avoid paying corporate taxes in Korea. This is, even though the source of profit is in Korea, they would pay taxes to foreign authorities. So this is a new challenge that was faced by the OECD countries. So then how can we find a way to make this connection between profit source and profit taxation? And initially, there were discussions on expanding the definition of PE, but gradually they realized that the extension of the PE concept would not be efficient because they needed a more simplified and more manageable approach. So that's BEPS Pillar 1 related issue. So in the digital economy, they were trying to come up with a new international taxation regime. So this discussion started several years ago. And recently, the digital tax agreement was reached. And there are two main points. First of all, there's an integrated approach or unified approach, and the second is a global minimum corporate tax issue. As for Pillar 1, regardless of the existence of permanent establishment, there will be sharing of taxing rights at the global level so that there will be a unified approach to taxation on profits from multinational companies. And secondly, this has to do with transfer pricing. So this is related to the PE issue, and there's other tax avoidance possibilities. So globally, multinational companies would pay more than 15% of effective corporate tax rate. So that's the global minimum corporate tax pillar. So these are the two pillars of the digital tax agreement, and this is to be implemented starting from 2023. When you look at the pillar 1, companies with global revenue above 20 billion euros and the profitability above 10% will be subject to this unified approach. And there are several remaining issues. In the past, there were countries that imposed digital service taxes, and these countries agreed to remove the existing digital service taxes, but the time frame is not easy to be decided because 137 countries out of 141 countries agreed. But for instance, in the US, there are some political discussions on this. And as for some other countries, they've been imposing digital service taxes for Pillar 1. If their tax revenue decreases because of the unified approach, then some countries may not be that happy. And moving on to Pillar 2, the scope is global revenue above 750 million euros. And as I mentioned before, this is at the global level. Effective corporate tax rate of 15% is the target. And there is another issue of income inclusion rate that I will skip because of the time constraint. Let's talk about the impact of these digital tax agreement on the outbound FTI from Korea. As for Pillar 1, this is about redistributing the taxation rights. And if we avoid double taxation, then you may think that the burden on companies may not increase. However, we also have to think about the reaction of these companies. When you are organizing and establishing a global supply chain, you may take into account tax avoidance to reduce burden on corporate taxation. So there are many global companies that have presences in countries where they have lower corporate tax rate. But then, according to this Pillar 1 of the unified approach, they may not have enough incentives for profit shifting. In other words, the entire supply chain will have higher taxation burden. Then the companies that will be affected by this are not necessarily the traditional manufacturing countries, but rather countries where companies where profit is generated from one place and taxes are paid on in the other place. So for Korea, we have many manufacturing companies, so the impact of the Pillar 1 may not be very big. And so we need to take a look at the Pillar 2. And for instance, we've been building the supply chain in the new southern region countries. And many outbound countries are going to Vietnam and Indonesia and so on. But Singapore, 7%, Indonesia, 11%, and Vietnam, 9.2% of corporate tax rate. This means that they have lower tax rates compared to the 15% target. When the Pillar 2 is applied, then because these companies are headquartered in Seoul, with this income inclusion rule applied, then these companies would have to pay more taxes in Korea because the corporate tax rates in these countries are lower than 15%. So this means that companies would have to bear more burden for tax payment, and this would potentially lead to loss of competitiveness for these companies. But then we have this outbound FTI to Vietnam, Singapore, and Indonesia may continue nevertheless, because when we advanced into these economies, these markets, we did not go into these markets for the sake of taxation, but for the sake of supply chain competitiveness. So this may not have a huge impact, but this will have some impact to a limited degree. And there may be some positive aspects of the digital tax agreement at the OECD on Korean companies, especially the digital and online companies. I mentioned about the example of Google and also Netflix. When Korean companies compete with Google or Netflix or other global companies, there may be some disadvantages that Korean companies had to suffer because of the tax differences. But I believe that with the digital tax agreement, some of these online companies will benefit. Thank you.
감사합니다. 이제
Thank you very much, Dr. Ye. You've told us a little bit about the agreements made on the digital tax and its impacts going forward. We are way behind schedule, but if there are any questions from the floor, we would like to entertain the questions now. Are there any questions?
네, 예, 질문이 없는 것 같으니까.
It doesn't look like there are any questions, so we would like to end session 2 here. And I would like to thank our 4 presenters and panelists, the doctors and professors, for taking time to be with us. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much. I would like to thank our panelists and speakers. You can now return to your seats. With that, we would like to conclude this seminar on 25 years of partnership with the OECD. We've looked at the past policies and past developments and future policy implications. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their discussion points and the presentations. Lastly, we'd like to hear from Lee Sung-ho, Deputy Minister for Economic Affairs at MOFA, for his closing remarks.
외교부
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm the Deputy Minister for Economic Affairs at MOFA. For the last 2 hours, we've been looking at the current status of Korea when it comes to this membership with the OECD, and we looked at future cooperation plans. It was very helpful. I remember working at OECD Paris. I remember participating in the 20th anniversary seminar. In just 5 years, we've seen that there have been huge developments made in not just Korea, but the global economy, because COVID-19 is currently ongoing. The pandemic has exacerbated the existing gaps and inequalities and brought in and ushered in the era of digital transformation. We need a collective intelligence to try to recover from all of these different difficult challenges. The last 2 hours of a seminar, although short, has allowed us to look at the past developments of Korea and look at the future as we prepare for the future. This was a very meaningful gathering. In the first session, we tried to look at all of the impressive economic developments, as well as developments made in different areas in the past, open economy, various different open institutions, which have led to a virtuous cycle with the economy and a society in quantitative and qualitative terms. However, despite these developments, we still see issues in environment, labor, and health and welfare, and we have room for improvement there. In the second session, we've been looking at one of the biggest current challenges at the moment, digital transformation, digital tax. In the digital economy, many different current challenges that are rising to meet us. With the digital initiative, we have to respond to the new norms and standards that are set in the digital era, and we also have to try to be more inclusive in our response to digital transformation around the world. It was a time for us to think about all of these different challenges and our response to them. Our world is more complicated than it was 25 years ago. We cannot respond to all of these different global and local challenges on our own. And this was a way for us to see that once again. I hope that this discussion would allow for an advanced progress in all of the different areas in Korea and contribute to more strong ties between us and the OECD. I would like to thank all of the experts and panelists, as well as the organizers at KIEP, and our online and offline audiences who've been with us until the end. In today's seminar, we also heard from several audience members some members of the diplomatic corps who are current candidates to their accession at the OECD. Hopefully, this discussion has been helpful for you in your discussions with the OECD going forward. With that, we would like to conclude this seminar, 25 Years of Partnership with the OECD. Thank you.
예, 감사합니다. 끝으로
Thank you very much. This seminar would be made available by video on YouTube. With that, we would like to conclude the seminar on 25 Years of Partnership with the OECD. Thank you.